Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
Jenna wandered through a terrible blizzard and crackling frost, practically fainting from the cold and severe pain. Everything around her was so snowed in that she couldn't see a thing. The woman got off the bus a couple of stops early, wanting to run to the supermarket and buy something for dinner. She didn't realize when the snowstorm had started. At first, it seemed to be just powdering. But with each passing minute, the gusts of wind were even stronger, and the snow was whirling and sweeping all around her and falling like a solid wall. Jenna could barely move her legs, and she scolded herself. Stupid. Idiot. She's due in 2 weeks, and I had the nerve to go to the cemetery in this weather. Would I die? I won't make it. Oh, Mommy, how it hurts. Ow, ow, oh, ow. As luck would have it, my stomach and back started hurting like hell. It looked like I was going into labor. That's all I need now, she thought anxiously. The woman rummaged in her pockets for her phone to call an ambulance, and she didn't find it. Could it be that she forgot it at home? I have no brains at all. Her stomach was hurting more and more. She simply couldn't walk any further, and her hands and feet were numb from the cold. Jenna tried to ask for help from passersby, but it was already dark outside, and the few people she saw on her way pretended not to hear her and hurried away to go about their business. The woman crouched in great pain, and with difficulty, climbed up the porch of the first doorway she saw and began chaotically dialing combinations of numbers, getting into one apartment and then another. She begged and literally screamed with all her might. Help? Call an ambulance. Open the door, please. I'm sick. I'm in labor. In one of the apartments, a man really answered at the beginning. I'll get it. Wait a minute. But then I heard a shriek, apparently from his wife. Don't you dare. Don't we have enough problems in life? Normal people stay at home in this weather, especially pregnant women. Let somebody else take care of her. She's obviously a beggar or a ragamuffin. Jenna cried in despair. What a time. What kind of people are so cruel? How hard can it be to call an ambulance and open the door so that the person didn't freeze to death? She could feel neither her arms nor her legs, only the piercing, painful contractions that burned like hot iron. Her legs shook and were not holding, and the woman dialed the number 46 in despair for the last time. She whispered with cracked, dry lips, "Please open the door. I'm dying." She no longer hoped that anyone would answer, but just sat down on the porch, unable to stand on her feet, and prepared to die a long and painful death. Suddenly a miracle happened, and a gray-haired old man came out on the doorstep. He was wearing a jacket hastily thrown over his shoulders, with only a light shirt underneath. When he saw a pregnant woman in a skinny coat and frail boots, obviously not designed for this weather, he aghast and rushed to her. "Woman, what's wrong with us?" "I'll call an ambulance." "Let's go. I'll help you at least to enter the entrance. You could get frostbite. Who in your position takes a walk in such a cold weather? Young people. What are they thinking about?" Jenna didn't have time to respond at all, just looked at her savior with eyes full of tears and gratitude, and screamed again from the strongest painful contraction and lost consciousness. Frank immediately assessed the situation as critical. The woman was clearly in labor. He called an ambulance, even though he knew it would take a long ride in such a snowstorm and unpaved roads. The man was long and confused when he explained to the dispatcher who was in labor and why it was happening in his apartment. But there was no way he could have waited any longer, so he began to drag the woman back to his apartment. Thank God it was the first floor. He spread a blanket on the floor in the corridor, put the woman in labor on the floor, and tried to bring ammonia to her nose and bring her to her senses. She finally regained consciousness and cried out at once, "Thank you. Don't think I'm not a beggar, and I'm not a beggar. I just decided to visit my dead fiancé at the cemetery today. It's his birthday today, you know. Well, I could not go. My feet carried me. I also left my phone at home. I know I'm an idiot, and I should not have left the house in this weather. My name is Jenna. I'm actually still in early labor. I'm due in 2 weeks. But all of a sudden, something's got me so pinched. Ow. Again. Mommy, it hurts. What should I do? Did you call an ambulance?" And she curled up again, biting her lip and trying to endure the searing pain. The man ran to find alcohol, sheets, poured warm water into a basin and commanded, "All right, Jenna, listen to me carefully. My name is Frank. I called an ambulance, but because of the snowstorm, it will probably take about an hour. And your contractions are getting more and more frequent, which by all indications means you're in labor in full swing. Don't ask anything, just trust me and do what I tell you. When the contraction starts, you have to breathe through your nose when I tell you to, and push, okay? I'm going to clean my hands and see where the baby's head is, okay? Okay? Don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you, on the contrary. I want to help you give birth to a healthy baby. Try to help me too. Is your pregnancy normal? Are you registered? Is the fetus positioned correctly? It's important. Try to remember. And don't panic. We don't need hysteria. Okay, is it starting? Repeat after me. Breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out." Jenna wanted to argue that she was scared, that she didn't know the man at all, and that anything could happen now. But the contractions really became more frequent and painful. She stopped understanding anything at all. She was drenched in cold sweat, and as in a fog, she tried to follow the man's commands. And he acted as a true professional, skillfully and accurately delivered the baby. And in half an hour, an adorable baby boy was born. Exhausted, but happy, Jenna watched as Frank deftly washed and patted him on the ass. The boy immediately cried out, so loud and shrill it was hard to hear. The man expertly swaddled the baby and placed him in Jenna's arms. Try feeding him. Don't be shy. You may not have milk yet, but it's very important that you do. Jenna cried with happiness, obediently complied with everything, and my son was really smacking his lips and trying to suckle. At last, the ambulance arrived. The young paramedic apologized for taking so long. They had barely made it to the edge of town as it was. He was simply amazed when he learned that an ordinary senior citizen had delivered a baby so professionally, and not in the conditions of a maternity ward, which has everything you need, but at home with nothing. Not every experienced obstetrician is capable of that. He began to shake his hand. "I'm just amazed. You are a real hero. You saved a woman in the freezing cold and delivered her baby at home. You should be in the news. I can't believe you have nothing to do with medicine." Frank flushed, pleased by this praise, and only waved his hand. "Yeah, it's a long story. I don't want to dwell on the past. I'm just a security guard in a supermarket, that's all." The chauffeur, who had entered the apartment at the request of the paramedic to transfer the woman in labor onto a gurney and take her to the maternity hospital, heard a fragment of this conversation, glanced at the hero, and was taken aback. Wait, that's the famous heart surgeon, Frank Crawford. He had 6 months' notice for his surgeries. The chauffeur jumped up to the pensioner and hugged him warmly. "You're Frank Crawford, the heart surgeon, aren't you? You at one time, my niece, Alice, literally saved the life. The valve on the heart changed. She still remembers you. She's such a jerk. What kind of a guard are you? Pardon me. Where did you disappear so suddenly? What a meeting. So you know how to deliver a baby. Respect and honor to you." The man was even more embarrassed. "Oh, come on. All about me, all about me. Jenna, out, better help. Because frankly, I was giving birth for the first time in my life. You never know what." With a fright, I remembered everything they once taught me at university. Let her gynecologist look at it. But for the kind words, thank you. I am very pleased. The woman and the baby were taken to the maternity hospital, and she squeezed his dry little hand goodbye and whispered her gratitude. "Thank you. You are my guardian angel, my savior. I will name my son after you, Frank. If it were not for your kind heart, I would have frozen in the cold. I thought there weren't such kind people left. I'm sorry I've been such a burden on your head. So much trouble because of me." Frank suddenly became worried. "Listen, I'm an idiot. You need to bring everything you need to the hospital, don't you? How will you be there without anything?" Jenna gibbered. "Here, the key to my dorm room. There's a big bag with everything packed in it, both for me and the baby. Bring it to me. If it's not too much trouble, tomorrow. Thanks again for everything." And she dictated her address, explaining the best way to get there. Then she cradled her son tenderly, and they took her to the maternity hospital. And Frank cleaned up the apartment and went over his past. And he was so bitter, his heart ached. 10 years ago, Frank Crawford was a famous heart surgeon, operating in the most prestigious hospital, with a wife, Helen, and a son, Rob. His wife worked with him in the department as an anesthesiologist. She too was loved and respected by all for her professionalism. They had met many years ago when they were medical students and never parted of each other again. Frank did not know how to make beautiful confessions. He was a very modest and shy young man. Although he fell in love with Helen, a perky chuckler and funny girl from the parallel stream immediately, he swooned over her smile, laughter, and the look of her brown eyes. He looked at her furtively and silently for a long time. And then he could not stand it, waited for her after the lectures, just took her hand and her bag in the other, and said, like a master, "Whatever you want, Helen, but I love you. Will you come with me?" The girl was taken aback and asked again, "Where am I going? Is this a joke?" But Frank more than seriously replied, "Will you go to the registry office? We'll get married tomorrow. We have a couple of months before graduation. I'm already working. With me you won't be lost. Can you believe it?" And he looked at her like that, and she believed him. They really went and got married. And they never separated again, lived soul to soul, and never even fought. When Rob was born, it couldn't happen happier because he was their beloved late baby. The boy grew up in love and prosperity, went to a private prestigious school, and showed great promise. After graduating from high school, he went to university to study economics. It seemed that life had long since settled down. Everything was going on as it should, in its own way. That fateful, blackest day in Frank's life literally ruined his whole destiny. Ruined it. Turned him into a draft. The whole family was vacationing in a country sanatorium. They often went there. Frank and his son loved to go fishing in the lake in silence, and Helen enjoyed swimming and sunbathing. And it just so happened that on that unfortunate day he was called to work urgently. A very grave patient had been brought, and his life had to be saved. His relatives understood everything and let him go with a light heart. So what if he would come to them again tomorrow? But at midnight, Frank got the terrible news. It was in their cabin that the wiring had shorted out, and his wife and son had died in the fire. This is an incredibly horrible and monstrous death. Frank's colleagues helped him bury his loved ones. He was completely insane and refused to believe that Helen and Rob were gone. Even at the funeral ceremony, he stubbornly insisted, "No, it's not Helen. Are you kidding me? What about Rob? How can that disfigured body be my son? It's just a mistake." At first, the staff felt sorry for him, gave him time off to recover. It was clear that he simply could not operate in such a state. And for nothing, Frank kept getting up at dawn, making oatmeal for Helen's breakfast and ham sandwiches for Rob, talking to them as if they were there. Then went to warm up the car, informing Alex, the neighbor, that he was already late for work and still had to take his wife to the store and his son to university. Then the neighbor, unable to endure this picture, finally echoed to the surgeon that there is no wife and son. No wife and son at all, and never will be. During this activity, they drank a bottle of alcohol, and after Frank could not stop. Only by drinking himself to death could he forget himself for a few hours in a restless sleep. And when he woke up, he would run to the supermarket for a bottle again to numb the terrible pain that was killing him. His longing for his wife and son was so strong that he was ready to dig his grave and lie down next to them, to die, just to be there, in the other world, with his family. So, imperceptibly, the once famous heart surgeon sank to the bottom. There was no one to help support, give him a friendly shoulder. He withdrew from work himself. Firstly, his hands were shaking. And secondly, he just physically could not tolerate sympathetic slanted glances and gossip. He had given up drinking a year earlier, just as abruptly and in the same day as he had started. Frank had a strange dream in his drunken stupor. Helen was looking at him sternly, holding the hand of little Rob for some reason, and reprimanding him like a schoolboy. "What are you doing, Frank? I didn't marry such a weakling. Stop it right now. What do you look like now?" A low-life bum, for God's sake. And remember, you have someone to live for. You just don't know it yet. Rob at the same time was crying and begging. "Daddy, don't drink. Please, I beg you. Don't." The man woke up in a cold sweat and jumped up on the bed like he was scalded. The terrible hangover was gone. His head suddenly became clear, and for the first time since his wife's death, he looked around. What he saw shocked him. Dust, filth, piles of dried and unwashed dishes everywhere. And he had even gotten to the crystal service because he was drunk. This apartment is a pigsty, and in Helen's time, everything here was shining and gleaming. How did he come to live like this? It's unbelievable. He looked apprehensively in the mirror and recoiled. From there, he looked at him, overgrown old alcoholic, with bags under his eyes and wrinkles. Where had the former gloss gone? He crossed himself and lifted his head up and whispered, "Thank you, honey, I got it. Not one more drop." Since that day, Frank hadn't had another gram of liquor. The neighbor, the one with whom he had started his drinking spree, was shocked. How could that be? What willpower? And Frank began to clear away the debris and put the apartment in order. It took almost 3 weeks of titanic labor. He removed piles of empty bottles and turned them in at a glass recycling center, cleaned the place for a long time, and kept it clean. Finally, when everything was as shiny and sparkling as when his wife was alive, he settled down. Then the man took care of himself, bought new, neat clothes, got a haircut, shaved, and even got a job at a supermarket as a security guard. He worked hard and did not get lazy. His colleagues respected him. And not to go crazy on weekends at home from boredom and loneliness, got a kitten. The pet was just a charm. He was black, and on the neck, as if someone has tied a white tie. He was so cute. The man loved to sit in an armchair, dozing and stroking the silky, pleasant hair of his pet. His soft purring soothed and somehow pacified Frank, so he lived, almost a recluse, in his apartment. The man had no hope for anything. He simply lived out his life. His health had deteriorated greatly. At the clinic, he received a disappointing diagnosis. And Frank hoped that at last he would soon meet his wife and son in the other world. But today's incident suddenly swept into his dull, lonely life and turned everything upside down. After Jenna was taken to the maternity hospital, Frank got up early and rushed to her dormitory to pick up her and the baby's bag of things. The smell of alcohol, cigarettes, and fried cheap fish knocked him off his feet as he entered. On seeing him, an unpleasant-looking older woman, whose face clearly showed signs of a turbulent life, remarked sarcastically, "Wow, has our little orphan already turned to old men, or has she found her father?" And she laughed loud and shrill. The pensioner looked at her reproachfully. "Shame on you, Jenna's in the maternity ward, so she asked me to give her a bag. Is that any way to talk about people? You're a woman too." The neighbor became serious in an instant. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I was just kidding. It's a little early, I think." "Wait here. Give this to her for me." And she handed the old man 2 apples. "Say so from Molly. She'll understand. Actually, Jenna's a good woman, just unlucky. Although the lucky ones don't really live here, you know." When he entered the miserable, cold room and looked around, he was horrified. The old windows were blowing mercilessly in spite of the fact that the woman had caulked them up with absorbent cotton and tape. The door was flimsy, and he could hear absolutely everything from the common corridor. The room itself was very clean, tidy, all the things and books in their places. The pensioner took a quick look at the bag. It was not dense there either, all the necessary things for the baby, and obviously sewn by himself. In the center of the table, in a black frame, stood a portrait of a young, handsome boy. There was a glass of vodka beside it and black bread on top. It turns out that just recently, some tragedy had happened in this poor woman's life, too. She did say something about why she was in the cemetery. After locking the door, the pensioner determinedly went to the store and bought diapers, bottles, and some clothes for the baby, as well as a new winter jacket for her and a newborn overalls in a beautiful blue color. He begged the nurse by slipping her a chocolate bar, and she let him into Jenna's room for a while, especially since she was there alone. The woman was very happy to see the old man and embraced him as if he were an old acquaintance or close relative. "Hello, Frank. Thank you again for everything. Oh, how nice that you came. Otherwise, I'm here with Frank completely bored. He is so quiet, sleeps and eats on schedule. Just a miracle, not a baby." The man got emotional. Did she really name her son Frank? Respect the old man. That's very nice. Let me have a look at the boy. Oh, he's cheeky. He's nice. How are you? How's your health? Going home soon? Jenna gibbered. Everything is fine. The doctor said that the delivery was done by a real professional. But he scolded me, of course, for being careless. I was really stupid. I went to the cemetery in that position. I just feel so sick and nauseous without James. My heart goes out to him. I would have lived there, in that cemetery, just to be near him. And she suddenly wept, so childishly, her tears rolling down her cheeks in large drops, her skinny body shuddering. Frank felt unbearably sorry for her. He sat on the edge of her bed, gently took her hand, and began to whisper, "I understand you, daughter. Like no one believed me. I lost my wife and son myself. I drank a lot. I hit rock bottom. I barely made it. I know how it hurts inside. I want to howl and shout, beat with my fists against the wall, and beg God to have mercy on you and bring your loved one back. Talk it out, you'll feel better." Jenna gratefully looked at him again and quietly began the story. "You see, I'm an orphan myself. I grew up in an orphanage, and I've suffered a lot over the years. I couldn't wish it on anyone. I was locked in a closet, teased and malnourished. It's been so many years, and I still can't eat bread. When I see someone throwing it in the trash, my heart bleeds. When I finished, I was given that miserable little room. There were no relatives. They knew that I would not go to complain, and who would listen to an orphan? Of course, I tried to at least wallpaper and paint the floor. But you saw for yourselves, they need a complete overhaul. And I won't even say a word about the common areas. Quiet horror. You can't wait for the ceiling to fall on your head. I went to school to become a seamstress. I graduated with honors. Even then, I was moonlighting, taking small orders from people. Neighbors, classmates all helped me and bought me a sewing machine for my birthday. That's how I met my James. He brought me a pair of pants to hem. One thing led to another. We got to talking, and we liked each other. We started dating. My fiancé was a construction worker. He was well paid, so we rented an apartment. He wouldn't agree to live in mine. There really aren't any human conditions there. Everything was so wonderful. We loved each other, with no memory of it. Even though we're both hot-tempered, we're not vindictive. Immediately we hug and kiss, and there is no resentment, evaporated. And what poems he wrote me himself. He would get up at night while I was asleep, write it, and in the morning he would lay it on my pillow for me to read. It was so pleasant. We filed a registry office application. James was also all alone. His grandmother brought him up. She died a long time ago. We decided not to celebrate the wedding, just a modest wedding. And then I started vomiting in the morning. I went to the doctor and found out I was pregnant. I was very worried how I should tell my fiancé that it might be too early. We somehow have not discussed this question yet. We thought we would live a little for ourselves and then have children. But James was so excited. He really wanted a baby. We started saving up so we could save for the birth, a stroller, and a good crib. But my fiancé spoiled me and bought me bananas and oranges. No one ever took care of me like that, like he did. He cared if I was eating well, so the baby would get his vitamins. And that day I was just finishing a dress for a customer when the phone rang. When they told me James was gone, I couldn't believe it. How could he be gone? There was a man, and then he was gone. Turns out there was an emergency at the construction site. James had fallen off the 10th floor. That's how my life ended. For good. All the money went to the funeral. I took my fiancé to his last journey, as it should be. And then all hell broke loose. There was nothing to pay the rent. I had to move into my room. It was cold there. I had to wear 3 socks. Hands are dropping. I kept thinking, crying, who needs my baby now? James is gone. He will never see his son. He will not be able to love him and raise him. Would I be able to raise a child on my own? And my heart was just bursting for my beloved. I can't forget him. I miss him terribly. It was only when you gave me Frank in your arms that I finally felt some warmth in my soul. I feed him, and it feels so good, my little lump of happiness. But still, it's very scary alone with a baby. Sometimes just panic sets in, to be honest. I don't even know how to take care of him. What did they teach us at the orphanage? Frank listened with tears in his eyes to this poor woman's confession and almost cried himself. So similar is their condition after the death of their loved ones. But he, an adult, an accomplished man in life and in his profession, broke down. And this young woman, left alone with a black grief, took this battle. She did not give up. He was touched and said firmly, "You know what, Jenna, I have a proposition for you. I'll take you and the baby back to my place when you're discharged. You don't want to be out there in the cold. You figure it out. How and where to bathe the baby there. It's drafty all around. He's bound to get sick. And I've got a big 3-bedroom, plenty of room for everyone. You already know me. We got to know each other. I'm a simple, non-confrontational person. I think we'll be friends. It's good for you, and I'm not bored. I'll help you with the baby. And my cat will be glad. So, do you agree?" Jenna cried again and wept. "Oh, thank you, Frank. I'm terribly embarrassed to be dumped on your head with my problems. But I think I'll take you up on your offer and live at least for the first time. I'm really worried about my son. It's no life for him there. I've been sick 3 times. I don't know how to thank you. You are just a golden man." After the man left, Jenna began to take apart the bag and almost cried again. There were so many things in there that she needed. Frank was the one who had finished it. What a good man. After all, she is, in fact, a complete stranger to him. Why does he care so much about her? For her, who grew up in an orphanage and never knew any warmth or affection, it was so wild with this manifestation of simple human participation in her fate. And though she did not understand the motives for such nobility, she was very pleased. And so they all began to live together. Jenna, Frank the little one, Frank and the cat. At first, the woman felt shy and awkward every time she asked if she could take this or that. But soon everything went into its normal course, and she became so cozy and comfortable in this hospitable apartment. It seemed that she and Frank knew each other for centuries. He was happy to help her with the baby, taught her a lot as a medic. Jenna, on the other hand, fed the old man with delicious borscht and cutlets, and sometimes spoiled him with pies. The cat liked to lie down at the baby's feet and purr, and cradle him in his own way. The only thing that bothered her was that her savior often had severe headaches. She took his blood pressure, slightly elevated, but not critical for his age. The woman often secretly watched him, trying not to show his pain, clenching his fists so white that his knuckles turned white, drinking handfuls of the strongest painkillers. But when she tried to ask Frank directly what was wrong with him, or suggested seeing a doctor, he only waved. "Don't worry about it, it's all nonsense. At my age, if you wake up and nothing hurts, then you're already dead. It's all about the change in the weather." But the woman knew he was just a distraction. He didn't really want to tell the truth. She hoped that he would reveal himself later and tell everything. She did not want to force her way into the man's soul. One day, Jenna started a general cleaning job, and Frank, not to be disturbed, volunteered to take Frank Jr. for a walk. He affectionately called him grandson. When the man returned an hour and a half later, he found Jenna staring at the portrait in amazement. She asked in surprise, "Where did you get this picture? I know this guy. Is he a relative of yours?" Frank almost cried. "Yes, honey, that's my son, Rob. May he rest in peace. I specifically took all the pictures of him and his wife in the closet. I cannot look until now without tears. My heart hurts. How much time has passed, and I still blame myself for the fire. I blame myself for leaving, for not being there. Maybe things would have been different, and I could have saved my family. Or maybe I would have burned with them all. We'd all be in heaven together, and now I'm all alone." Jenna waved her hands. "It can't be. That's Dan, a friend of my late fiancé. He's a paratrooper. They served together. He was at the funeral, too. And before that, he sometimes came to visit us. I'm not out of my mind yet. How is it possible? I don't get it, do I? The old man thought hard, remembering something, then said, You know, Jenna, actually my wife gave birth to twins. But when she came to herself after a very difficult birth, she was told the terrible news that one of the babies was stillborn. We, of course, grieved, buried our son in the cemetery, everything as it should be. There can be no mistake. I personally dealt with the funeral. My wife just could not, so crying. She even lost her milk on nerves. We had to feed Rob with formula. I want to find this Dan. You said you have a picture of him. Will you show me tomorrow? Do you know where he lives? Jenna enthusiastically set out to help Frank. This mystery kept her busy. She wanted to find out and understand how it was possible that two completely alien people were as much alike as 2 drops of water. After all, such miracles simply do not happen. The woman went home and brought back the very picture of Dan and her late fiancé, James. The old man looked at it for a long time, compared it to the portrait of his son, and was amazed. You're right, it's just like that. I thought you were exaggerating. Do they look alike? I've never seen anything like that. How are we supposed to find out where he lives? I can't wait to talk to him and find out. Who is he? What kind of family did he grow up in? Jenna had no trouble finding out Dan's phone number through mutual acquaintances, because he lived in their own city. The very next day she called him and asked to meet him. He knew Jenna because he and James were best friends in the army, and of course he agreed to come. He wondered if the woman needed any help. He couldn't help but respond. When Dan arrived at the address Jenna gave him, he was surprised to see a woman with an infant in her arms and an elderly man. Hello, Jenna. Oh, is that your baby boy? I'm sorry, I didn't know you were pregnant when James was gone. Isn't that James' son? The woman tried to explain everything. Hello, Dan. Yes, this is Frank, son of James. You're right. Well, I wasn't old enough at the time, and I didn't have much time. I'd lost someone I loved, and I'd barely made it out alive, so not a lot of people know about it. But it's not about my son. I'd like you to meet him. This is Frank. He's a famous surgeon and a very good man. Now he will tell you himself why he wanted to see you. Dan was confused. Good afternoon, I'm Dan. Nice to meet you. But I can't remember, do I know you? The old man waved his hands. No, Dan, we don't know each other personally. But it just so happens that Jenna saw a picture of my dead son, Rob, and started claiming that it wasn't Rob at all, but her friend Dan. Here, take a look for yourself. What do you think? The young man couldn't understand anything yet, but when he looked at the portrait, he was completely swooning. He was looking at him, just like him, only his hair was different. Longer hair and a slanted parting. But he looked the same. He couldn't tell the difference. He did not understand anything and began to tell me about himself. I don't know how that's possible. I was raised by my mother alone without a father. But in another city, 100 kilometers away from here. I'm definitely not adopted. I've seen the birth certificate 100 times. To tell the truth, we had no father or other relatives, so we lived with my mom alone until she died. Unfortunately, 6 months ago. It still hurts to talk about it. She was the best, loved me a lot, pitied me always. My mother's name is Wendy. Maybe you know her somehow, but I don't know anything about it. She worked all her life as a kindergarten teacher. The old man shook his head dejectedly. No, I don't know such a person exactly. I still have an excellent memory for names and surnames. You see, my wife gave birth to twins, and she was told that one child had died. We mourned and buried him. Something doesn't add up. How are we supposed to find out and solve this mystery of similarity? Especially since your mother, Dan, is no longer alive, and neither is my wife. Some kind of stalemate looms. Dan hesitated, then suddenly exclaimed, Look, you can go to a private detective agency. Maybe they can help you find a clue. The old man suddenly perked up. That's right, I'm an old fool. No brains at all. I have a good friend. I once saved his life on the operating table. I remember he gave me his card. He said I could help you, I could solve any problem. I don't throw things like that away, just in case they come in handy. If he hasn't retired yet, he'll definitely help. A very good investigator, Peter. He used to solve such high-profile and complicated cases, not like ours. I'll try to call him and arrange it. That's what we decided. Then everyone drank tea, and Dan said goodbye. Can I hold Frank in my arms? Not a stranger after all, James' son. Jenna smiled and nodded her head in agreement. She really liked Dan as a person, always calm and judicious, only very shy and silent. He took the baby reverently, and he smiled so funny with his toothless mouth. And he grunted, feeling that someone else had taken him. Dan laughed. Look at you, so little, and already he's making a face at me, just like James did when he was a kid. That's hilarious. He's so funny. He looks just like him. I wish James had lived to see this moment. He would have been happy, because you, Jenna, my friend, loved you very much. I know that for a fact. As agreed, Frank actually found the investigator's business card and asked to see him. The man was pleased and agreed, inviting the former surgeon to a cafe. The old acquaintances embraced amicably. Peter exclaimed, "Hello, Frank. How many years, how many winters? Very glad to see you. Do not think I have not forgotten, thanks to whom I beat my engine. Thank you, you saved my life back then. I take it something happened, and now you need help. I'd be happy to help you, especially since I'm long retired. I have my own detective agency. Well, I can't do without a search. As my wife says, the case is clinical and cannot be cured." Frank took out a portrait of his son and Dan and put it on the table. "Let's get to the point. Here, look. This picture is of my dead son, Ivan, and this one is a complete stranger to me, Dan. I met him, we talked. He was raised by his mother in the next town. There's nothing in common, I guess. But you see, the similarities are phenomenal. My wife had twins at one time, but one of the children died and we buried him properly. Only Rob survived. Can you help me solve this mystery, my friend? I would be very grateful." Peter spluttered his hands. "You're like children, I swear. The first thing to start with is to give samples for genetic analysis to you and Dan. That way we'll know for sure if you're related or not. In the meantime, I'll see what I can find out from the maternity hospital and its staff. We'll be in touch. Believe me, miracles do not happen. There is a logical explanation. I will do my best to help you, Frank. Don't doubt it." The old man called Dan and offered to do a genetic examination. He was very surprised, but agreed. "I don't think we can be related, of course, but the mystery of our resemblance to your son, frankly, is very puzzling to me. So let's clear up any doubts already." "I don't mind. I went through all the old papers and documents at home. No certificates or other evidence that I was not the native son for my mother I could not find. But it doesn't work like that either. I looked at all the pictures of my mom, my late grandmother and grandfather, and I kind of look like them a little bit. Well, let's see what the experts have to say." When the results came back, absolutely everyone was shocked. It turned out that Frank and Dan were father and son. It was unbelievable, and it made everything even more confusing and unclear. How on earth did this happen? Who had Frank buried instead of his stillborn son then? What the hell had happened? To have a native son for so many years and not know about it. 3 weeks later, Peter called and invited everyone to his agency. Dan went too. He was just burning with curiosity and wanted to know the truth, whatever it was. The investigator seated everyone and began his report. "I found out everything, guys. I can't say it was easy. Because both women in labor, the subjects of this tangled story, were already dead. But I was able to track down the very midwife who delivered both women that night. Her name is Kate. Well, the woman at first stubbornly refused to communicate, even hung up on me. I thought it was more than strange, because if a person has nothing to hide, then why is he so nervous? Then I found a nurse, fortunately, still alive and healthy, though very old. She hinted to me that a substitution occurred that night. The nurse accidentally heard a fragment of the conversation, but did not tell me anything else either. She was afraid. Then I pressed the midwife. She had her own methods. She confessed everything. Turns out Kate and your Dan mom were best friends. That's why your mom went to give birth in this maternity hospital, and not by registration, as it should be. At first, everything went well. In spite of the difficult delivery and the woman's 40 years of age, the baby still came into the world, albeit with a weak heart. But a couple of hours later, disaster struck. During a routine round of the adaptation room, Kate noticed the lifeless body of a baby. It was just her friend's newborn. Upon learning of this, your mother Dan began to sob and beg for help. After all, the doctors in her critical age and health condition warned her that she would never be able to have children again. That day next to her, your wife, Frank, gave birth to 2 healthy boys. The midwife was reluctant at first. She would not agree, understanding that it was a criminal offense, and if anything, she would go to jail for a long time. But her friend cried so hard and promised her a lot of money for that time. The friend's heart trembled. Her mother was very ill at the time, and she needed money urgently. The situation was surprisingly good for the midwife. The June holiday of the Day of the Medic, that night gathered all the doctors and nurses on duty in the nursing room. No one even noticed Kate, who had been away for a short time. That's how she managed to change the babies and rewrite the tags on the pens. No one suspected a thing. Stuff happens. That was it. You, Frank, were given a dead child, and your twin son, alive and well, was given to a stranger's woman. All the records were kept as if one of the twins had died. Those were different times. Nobody knew that an expertise existed, and you were heartbroken and did not bother to find out the truth, although it would have been quick to follow up on the case. After all, Rob had survived, which means that life goes on. That's how that midwife got away with it. Your mother, Dan, can certainly be humanly understood. She was desperate and clinging to any straw. But I can't justify the midwife who committed such a crime. How can she dispose of the lives of others? Who gave her that right? Destroy other people's lives and destinies. The hair on my head stood on end when I heard all this. It's crazy. Well, anything can happen, but you can adopt a child. How many of them, the poor ones, are in orphanages? Why steal someone else's child? And if she were a disadvantaged mother who had given birth and didn't need children, why steal someone else's? But knowing what long-awaited children your wife has, Frank, to do such a mean thing is unbelievable. Dan sat there in complete shock. 1,000 thoughts were jumbled in his head. It turned out that all this time he had been living someone else's life, not his own. Someone had rewritten his fate for him back in the maternity ward. And he was raised by a woman who was completely alien to him, and he sincerely loved her and called her his mother. But he could have had a completely different life, with his twin brother and blood parents who were completely normal people. He looked at Frank very differently now, looked at every feature of his face and looked for similar native features, and he found them. The boy suddenly thought, my God, if it hadn't been for Jenna and her chance encounter with Frank, he, Dan, would have gone on living like this, thinking that he had no relatives left on this earth. And it turns out that he and his own father live in the same city, walk the same streets, and are completely unaware of each other's existence. In a burst of emotion, he walked up to the old man and embraced him for the first time warmly and truly sincerely. Hello, Daddy. I'm glad we found each other. We have a lot to talk about and a lot to catch up on in our relationship. But I know the main thing, we're together now. And I won't leave you, no matter what happens. Frank was in tears. He was so nervous. Suddenly, a severe headache flashed through his eyes, and he lost consciousness, collapsing on the floor. Peter and Dan got terribly frightened, called an ambulance, and tried to bring the old man to his senses by splashing cold water on him. Finally, little by little, Frank began to come to his senses, feeling a little better. Dan started asking him questions. What's the matter with you, Daddy? How often do you get so sick? The elderly man sighed and confessed. Well, to be honest, 6 months ago I was diagnosed with a cerebral vascular aneurysm. I couldn't understand why my head was hurting so much. No pills helped. My vision began to fall. I was seeing double vision, often nauseated. And when I learned my diagnosis, I gave up on everything. Only surgery can help, otherwise this tumor will simply burst. There will be a brain hemorrhage and death. Surgery costs crazy money. I never had and never will. And who needs me? The sooner I die, the sooner I'll meet Helen and Rob in the afterlife. Except that I'm having these attacks more and more often, especially if I get too nervous. I hope I don't have long to suffer." Dan ran up to the old man and hugged him. "What are you talking about, Daddy? I need you. Jenna needs you. I just found my own father, and you say it won't be long now. I'll find out everything. I'll take you to the doctor, and we'll fix you. I want you to have surgery and get better. For my sake, do you hear?" That same day, Dan went for a walk with Jenna and the baby in the park and started telling her all about it. "Did you know Frank was terminally ill? Why didn't you tell me? It turns out he needs an expensive emergency surgery. He fainted today in a private investigator's office. Can you believe it? And he's also my own father." Jenna was shocked by what she heard. "Actually, he takes a lot of pills, and he complains of headaches. But as much as I asked him, he didn't say anything. I guess he didn't want to upset me. We have to help him. There's no one else. He's a wonderful man. My son and I owe our lives to that holy man. I can see why Frank decided to leave his apartment to me. What should we do, Dan? Why don't we take out a loan? We could try to sell my shabby little room, but it wouldn't fetch much, of course. That's all I've got." The guy hesitated, then answered, "I'll sell the car. That should be enough. I'll do it tomorrow. I don't need this pile of iron when a man's life is at stake. In the meantime, find a clinic and a good surgeon. Time is of the essence. We can't wait. I just found my father, and I can't let anything happen to him." The young people got actively involved, and 3 weeks later everything was ready, and Frank was admitted to the ward for surgery. Everyone was very worried. Dan and Jenna took turns being on duty at the hospital and sitting with Frank Jr. During this time, the boy became so attached to the baby. He stuck with him from the bottom of his heart. He learned how to bathe and feed him, cradle and play with him. Frank always smiled at him and very rarely got fussy. Dan often caught himself thinking that he couldn't imagine his life without Jenna, Frank, and Daddy. After all, what did he have before that? A job, friends, and loneliness in an empty rented apartment. There were girls, of course, and the guy was cute. But no matter how many times Dan tried to start a serious relationship, it just wasn't working. He didn't click. He didn't get the feeling inside that that was it, mine for life. He was not interested in short flirtations. He wanted a long and substantial relationship. But all came across calculating girls. Buy an expensive gift. Take her to a cafe. She is yours. If it's just tea in the kitchen, then excuse me, goodbye. Now he often watched as this seemingly ordinary, unremarkable woman cleverly prepares dinner, babysits baby, and involuntarily admired her. For some reason, his heart was beating very often. He wanted to hug her, hold her, touch her, kiss her. But he always told himself, "Don't you dare. She's almost your best friend's wife. How will it look if we get close to her? What if she gets offended or misunderstands?" Jenna often thought about Dan too. She compared him to James, listened to herself. They were completely different. James was so emotional, so open, his emotions written all over his face. And Dan was silent, all thinking and looking at her strangely. But why was she so attracted to him? Like a magnet? She was even a little ashamed, as if she were betraying her fiancé's memory by thinking of another man all the time. But the more Jenna tried to run away from her feelings, to hide them away in the farthest corner of her soul, the more she felt that she needed Dan like air. Everything was gray without him, and with him it was so easy and peaceful. The operation was hard. It was unclear what would happen next. Frank suddenly slipped into a coma and was between life and death. The doctors honestly admitted that the chances of recovery were 50-50. But Dan and Jenna believed he would recover, and every day they took turns being at his bedside, talking to him, reading to him, telling him how much they loved him. 3 weeks went by, and the man still wasn't coming around. Then Jenna took a risk, and deceiving the nursing staff, waited for a moment when no one was in the ICU, came to the old man's room with her son. She literally carried him through the womb. She whispered in his ear, "Don't let me down, my dear, be quiet. We are going to say Grandpa." And he seemed to understand, didn't make a sound, just sniffed to himself. The woman went into the room. She sat down on a chair and began to talk. "Hello, Frank. We miss you very much, Frank especially. Get well soon. We feel so bad without you. You are like a father to me. Dan is exhausted." They say I read that there is a connection between the person who delivered the baby and the baby. Let's check it out. She gently laid the baby next to Frank. "You were the first to hold Frank in your arms. You gave him life. Listen to the song my son and I are singing for you at home, and we pray that you will recover quickly." And she sang softly a lullaby, and the baby echoed her and spoke in his own way and sang along. And in the end, he babbled something that sounded like a grandfather's word. Jenna cried out, "Wow, Frank called you a grandfather. Do you hear that? He loves you too. Wake up, please. You must live." And then the old man's eyelids fluttered open, and he tried to wiggle his fingers. All the readings on the monitor beeped and blinked. Jenna grabbed the baby, jumped out of the room, and ran to the desk nurse. "Hurry. Intensive care. Frank seems to be coming to." She hissed at her in horror. "Ho gave you permission to go in there with a baby? You'll get me the hell fired. You're out of your mind. Step out into the hallway right now." Frank was in a sort of viscous, enveloping fog the whole time. He couldn't figure out whether he was going to the next world or the next. After all, there, very close, it seems, his hand is stretched out, his Helen and Rob. And on the ground, Dan was worried about him and was waiting for Jenna and her grandchild. He could hear them calling his name, asking him to come back, and he wanted to answer them, but somehow his body didn't seem to be his. He tried to wake up, but his eyes would not open. It was only when he heard the words of Frank, the very baby he had helped give birth to, that he knew the answer for sure. He must return to them. Who would help them? After all, it's so great to be called Grandpa. And to Helen, he will definitely come back when his time comes. At this very turning point, Frank strained hard and tried again to open what seemed to be unreachable eyelids. Oh miracle, he succeeded. At first, all the silhouettes were blurred, but then the image became clearer. Indeed, Frank opened his eyes with difficulty and could barely move his lips as he tried to speak. "I love you too." Jenna was in the hallway sobbing and calling Dan to work. "Dan, honey, your daddy's awake. We got it right." When he heard the baby trying to talk, he came to his senses right away. "Hurry up and get over here." The boy immediately got off work and rushed to the hospital. All the way in the bus, he prayed that his father would recover, get well, and come home quickly. When Dan entered the room, he saw that Frank was no longer on life support and that a delegation of doctors was standing around him, checking for reactions. He rushed to his father, unable to control his feelings, and kissed him. "Daddy, honey, you're awake. What a joy. Now everything will be all right. We feel so bad without you. Get well soon." Frank felt so warm and good, probably for the first time since the tragic death of his wife and Rob. He wanted to live again with a terrible intensity. He was ready to fight the hateful disease, and he knew he would get better. Life now had meaning. Someone needed him. The retired man was insanely grateful that Jenna had called his apartment that night. From that moment on, Frank's destiny changed abruptly. Everything was turned upside down, and life began to play in the same colors as before. First, Jenna and the baby came into his life, and then his own son was found. The old man suddenly remembered the dream when Helen had told him in his dream, "You have someone to live for, only you don't know it yet." And that's how it turned out. It turns out that she knew it would happen, and she wanted to keep him out of trouble, to prevent him from sliding into the abyss completely and precipitously. The old man said quietly, "Thank you, son, for everything. I know you sold a nice car to pay for the surgery, and Jenna took such good care of me. You are all one big family to me now. You know what, son? Why don't you move in with me too? Just in time for everyone to have a room, and I'll be happy to have you around. What do you say?" Dan smiled. "Thank you, Daddy. I'm all for it. You know, I've become so attached to the baby and Jenna that I can't imagine life without them either. I also really like her. I might even be in love with her. I'm just afraid to tell her that. She is, after all, the fiancé of my dead friend James. And I'm kind of embarrassed for him, even though he's dead. The man got serious and advised, I'll tell you this, son. You can't lift James up anymore. You can't live in the past. I too have long clung to it, tormented myself, tormented and suffered. I drank, and I almost went to the abyss. Listen to yourself and your heart. It's better to confess to Jenna and get rejected than to worry about something that might not happen. I think she really likes you too. She's got a lit-up eye. Only she's just as driven away by those feelings as you are. She's afraid of betraying James' memory. Just tell her everything you feel, then you will know the truth for sure. You'll feel better either way. Dan hugged the old man. Thanks for the advice, Dad. It's great that now we can have a heart-to-heart talk like men. You know, every time I say the word daddy, I savor it. All my childhood, I dreamed of my father. I missed him so much. But I want you to know that in spite of everything, I don't blame my mom for anything. What she did, of course, terrible, no doubt. But she loved me completely sincerely. I felt it, and always knew it. She tried to say something to me before she died, but did not have time. I only understood the phrase, Son, I am so guilty before you. You forgive me. But I thought she was just delirious in her fever and didn't pay any attention to them. And she apparently wanted to repent after all, but she went to heaven first. From that day on, Frank was on the mend, and 2 weeks later he was brought home. Upon entering the apartment, he immediately noticed the changes. Jenna was fluttering, her eyes beaming and glowing with real happiness. She even looked so different and transformed. She had a fancy haircut, styled her hair differently, and had a blush on her cheeks. The table was bursting with treats. Frank, the head of the family, was seated in the center, and the food was served. Jenna and Dan looked at each other slyly, but tried to pretend they were just friends. It wasn't working, to put it bluntly. Then Frank couldn't take it anymore, laughed, and said, What, are we like children? I know you're together now. Why are you hiding? I'm very happy about it. Now we're one big happy family. There's no greater reward for an old man. Love and advice. You both deserve it. Isn't that right, grandson? Oh, I'd like to drink whiskey now, to your health and mine. But you can't. I promised Helen. So pour, Jenna, peach juice. And Frank happily began to hum and smile, like a little sunshine. Everyone felt so easy and good at heart. They matched each other perfectly, as if they had lived together for many years before. Let them all work out great, because they deserve it.